Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to Good Orderly Direction, Practical Tools of the Bible. Today we're discussing Genesis 37. Joseph gets sold into slavery. I'm your host, Dr. Donnelly Snipes. A book that I would encourage you to consider looking at is called Was Joseph on the Spectrum? Understanding Joseph Through the Torah, Midrash, and Classical Jewish Sources by Samuel J. Levine. This is a really interesting book that challenges us to interpret Joseph's behaviors from the perspective of someone who is on the autism spectrum. So the story starts out. Joseph was 17 years old and tended the flock with his brothers. Joseph regularly complained about or tattled on them to his father. Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he was born when Jacob was old. Well, one of the things that we see here, we recognize that Rachel gave birth to Joseph and Benjamin, and those were the last two children that she had. So yes, these are his youngest children, and Joseph was the first boy child from Rachel. So he holds a special place in Israel's heart. This is probably true because Rachel held a special place in Israel's heart. However, we need to explore whether Jacob loved him more than everybody else or whether there might be another explanation. So the scripture goes on. Jacob made for Joseph a long robe. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of his brothers, they hated him and couldn't even talk nicely to him. So was Joseph really the favorite, or did he need acts of love because he had special needs? Maybe he had sensory differences that required him to have clothing that was of a different material, or clothing that was heavier in order to provide the pressure that was required to help him feel calm. We don't know. We can only speculate. The brothers engaged in a lot of mind reading and assumed that Israel loved Joseph the most. Scripture says that he did. Is that a literal translation, or did he have different acts of love? Did he have to pay more attention to Joseph because Joseph had needed more attention? How often have you engaged in mind reading and assumed someone was getting some special treatment for what I call an unrighteous reason? They didn't earn it. They're just getting special treatment because they're the favorite. This theme of sibling rivalry harkens back to Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, and now Joseph and his brothers. So we're seeing through the lineage that this pattern persists, and we see this even in modern day. God repeatedly shows us how jealousy tears families apart, and that no two children are exactly alike. And even in the New Testament, Jesus talks about how it's important to respect one another. We're not all the same. Joseph told his brothers of a dream he had had. We were out binding sheaves of grain in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" They hated him even more because of what he said. So we see that Joseph is not really picking up on social cues very well. And we have to wonder, at 17, that is an odd age for him to still be tattling and bragging and indicating that he is going to be the ruler over all of his family. So there's a little bit that's odd here. Then Joseph told his father and his brothers of another dream. This time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Not only are sheaves of grain are one thing, but when you start talking about the heavens bowing down to him, that is pretty out there. His father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually bow down before you?" His brothers were jealous, but his father kept the matter in mind. Israel, with age, has learned that sometimes prudence is necessary. You may not agree with what you hear. It may be flat wrong. However, he didn't know that it was wrong, and so he tabled it. He said, there's really no point in arguing this anymore with Joseph. He had this dream. This is his interpretation, and he chose, using his prudence, he chose to let it drop at that. It's possible that through the dreams, God is trying to provide hope and let Joseph know of the good things that will come to comfort him through the hard times that are ahead. We need to remember, life is never perfect, and right now a lot of us are really struggling, and it's important to remember that patience, earnestness, and endurance can help us succeed, even when it's hard. When it's easy, when you've got the wind at your back, it's easy to just run forward. When it's hard, when you've got the wind coming straight at you, when you've got the resistance coming straight at you, and it's like everything you can do to put one foot in front of the other, you're still making forward progress. Not as quickly, but if you endure and you have patience and you just keep doing the next right thing, a lot of times, I'm not going to say every time, but a lot of times, you will emerge stronger and more victorious. Fast forward a little bit for those of you who already know the story. Joseph is sold into slavery and goes through a lot of trials. Ultimately, he becomes very powerful again. And because of his power, he's able to save his father and his brothers from a famine. And he says in Genesis 45:5, "Don't be angry with yourselves that you sold me here. Actually, God sent me before you to save lives." Joseph, in his own way, had tried to make sense of what had happened. And sometimes we call this cognitive restructuring. He recognized that it did him no good to dwell on anger and resentment and self-pity when things were going poorly. He recognized that if he proceeded with good, orderly direction, patience, respect, truthfulness, endurance, all that stuff that we talk about, that if he kept doing the next right thing, it would all work out. He really believed that. He also embraced the dialectics. He recognized that sometimes bad things have to happen for good things to emerge. Sometimes there is a growth period, if you will. How do dreams help keep you moving forward even when everything seems to be falling apart? How does that prize, that light at the end of the tunnel, keep you moving forward even when it feels like there is a hurricane force wind pushing against you? Sometime later, his brothers were out in the pasture, and Israel sent Joseph to check on them. His brothers saw him coming and plotted to kill him and blame it on an animal. His brother Reuben and Judah spoke up and tried to rescue him. The other brothers conceded that, okay, we won't kill him, but they did sell him to the Ishmaelites. They took Joseph's robe, dipped it in animal blood, and returned it to Israel, claiming that an animal had killed him. In reality, Joseph had been sold to one of the Pharaoh's officials in Egypt. More lessons from this chapter. There's always so much stuff in every chapter that we can learn if we just really sit down and go through it granularly. Israel often seemed to fail to think things through when it came to parenting. Think back to Dinah. She was 13, and 13-year-olds, even back then, were not as able to protect themselves. Sending a 13-year-old girl into the village to see and be seen was probably not a good choice, or allowing it to happen. They didn't send her, they just didn't prevent her. So he probably wasn't thinking things through and being prudent in his actions. When Dinah was assaulted, he didn't think things through. How are her brothers going to react when I tell them this? So as soon as they came back from the field, he told them what had happened, and they reacted with rage. And they reacted impulsively and went and slaughtered the people in the town. He also didn't think very prudently when he encouraged Joseph to go out into the fields by himself and bring back a report on his brothers. That's kind of poking the bear, if you will. His brothers also seem to have not learned prudence. Yes, when you've been wronged, anger is a natural emotion. Anger is your body's way of saying, hey, there might be a threat. It gives you the energy to respond to that threat to stay safe. It doesn't mean that you have to act. It especially doesn't mean you have to act impulsively. It's really important to consider the far-reaching and long-term impact of your actions. When Cain sought revenge on Abel for showing him up, if you will, in front of God, and then Cain murdered Abel, how do you think that made Adam and Eve feel? Jacob was jealous of Esau and tricked Isaac into giving him the blessing. Then Esau was enraged, and Jacob had to flee to an entirely different, part of the countryside in order to avoid Esau's wrath. Then Israel, who was Jacob, his sons also react impulsively, and when they react to Dinah, and also when they react to Joseph, they don't consider, how is this going to impact me in the long run? How is this going to impact the people I love, my mother, my father, my siblings? When they sold Joseph into slavery, it was devastating for Reuben and Judah, especially. They had tried to save or at least prevent this from happening. And so that created a rift between them, but it also devastated Israel. And, Rachel was no longer alive, so obviously it didn't impact her. But we've got to think, how did all this impact the family dynamics? The sons of Leah were essentially responsible for the demise of Rachel's firstborn. How does that impact how Israel sees Leah and how Israel interacts with those boys henceforth? Prudence is the main theme in this story. Was it prudent to make Joseph a special garment and nothing else for the other children? If we assume that he did this because Joseph actually is the favorite, this sows the seeds of discord. What lessons might we learn from that? What lessons might we learn as parents about showing favoritism? How or why does the youngest child, even today, often get what's perceived to be preferential treatment? There are a lot of reasons from a psychological standpoint. It could be that the caregivers recognize, well, this is our last chance to get this right, and then we're not going to be parents anymore, and empty nest syndrome and all that kind of stuff. So that can be one reason. Another reason can be as simple as parents have gotten better at parenting with each successive child. So the youngest one is treated differently, not because the parents love them anymore, but because the parents have honed their parenting skills. There can be a lot of reasons, so we need to step back and look and say, wonder why this is happening. Was Israel truly using Joseph for supervising the older children? If so, why would this be? What else might Israel's motivation have been besides, sending him out to because he was the favorite to supervise the children. If he was on the spectrum, if Joseph was on the spectrum and had difficulty reading social cues and didn't really care about the relationship with his brothers, it's possible that Israel was exploiting that. It's also possible he may have been sending Joseph out hoping that they would somehow make amends. Again, we don't know. Was it prudent to put Joseph in such a position, especially when we already know there's some tension between the sons of Leah and the sons of Rachel? What would be a more prudent way to handle jealousy, resentment, or perceived unfairness? So thinking good orderly direction. What would be a better way if you're feeling jealous or you think somebody's getting preferential treatment over you? What's a better way to handle it? What's the best way to handle it in a compassionate, prudent, respectful sort of way? In these early stories, God emphasizes how much of an impact caregivers have on their children and their children's children. We start seeing mistakes that aren't addressed repeated over and over again. And it's important to recognize that, maybe this is God's way of pointing to us that we need to regularly take an inventory and ask ourselves, what can we do better?